Hello, my name's Adrian Smith and I'm the Associate Rector at St George's and also Priest in Charge at Wrangthorne. And a welcome to you if you're from St George's or from Wrangthorne, or a new visitor to our services at St George's for the first of our Holy Week reflections. Today on Maundy Thursday, we will begin by reading together from John's Gospel, chapter 13 and verses 1 to 17. The incident where Jesus is washing the disciples' feet. Our reading for our first reflection here in Holy Week comes from John chapter 13, and I'll start reading at verse 1. It was just before the Passover. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that he poured water into a basin, and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "A person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not every one was clean. When he'd finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I've done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should also wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I've done for you. I tell you the truth. No servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." The table is set and everyone's arrived. There's a real sense of anticipation as the celebrations begin. Discussion and debate about who's sitting where has been sorted, and now conversations are shifting from what has happened to what will occur. Friends and family have come together. The highlight of the Jewish calendar was beginning. Passover celebrations cemented together the dynamics of Jewish social, cultural and religious identity. At the heart was the Seder, the Passover feast, a time of celebration and rejoicing that dramatically recounted the deliverance of the Hebrew people, which God accomplished through the Exodus. The first Passover occurred after the plagues were brought upon Egypt, where the Israelites were enslaved and captive. God told Moses to have the Israelites sacrifice a lamb and mark the door frames of their homes with the lamb's blood. The angel of death would come to Egypt, but it would pass over the households that were marked by blood. The sacrifice of the lamb would redeem the people of God and restore the relationship with God that had been distorted, damaged, and destroyed by sin. But the sound in the room is getting louder, as in twos and threes, sometimes across the table, sometimes turning to the neighbour next to us. Individuals are competing to be heard. The only brief interlude is when discussion is paused to take another mouthful of food or drink. But then the room starts to go quiet. One or two voices can initially be heard, but then all conversation stops. Attention turns from what is being said to what's happening. John, the writer of the Gospel, uses some very evocative words to describe what happens next. His language is rich in meaning, so as not to leave any of his first readers in doubt that he wants them to grasp that this particular celebration of the Passover is not just about what's happened in the past, as important and as informative that is to our understanding of our Christian faith. But he wants them to fully grasp that what goes on during this meal is speaking as much about what is to come in the days that followed, events that would impact all of humanity, as the Son of God would give his life as a sacrifice, shed his blood that sin may be atoned for, die that the broken relationship with God, ourselves, others, and the world around us may be restored. Jesus is the one, by what he is about to do, who shifts the focus of attention. His apparently bizarre actions concentrate the minds of those gathered for a meal, not on the past, but on what is to come. But more than this, they again remind his disciples that behind all the symbolism, all the history, the tradition, the images, the metaphors, the picture language, it is he, Jesus, that is a relationship with God. Verse in 4 and 5, we read that Jesus gets up. He rises from the table. The very same language used later in the Gospel for his resurrection. We're told Jesus takes off his outer clothing. Technically, he's laying down his garment. The very same descriptor used by Jesus when talking of how he voluntarily lays down his life as a shepherd for the sheep. Jesus wraps a towel around his waist. He prepares himself. The conscious choice to put into action his decision, his will. Jesus chose to follow the Father's will to death on a cross. Jesus, who then washed the disciples' feet, washing and cleansing, the language of preparing people for a relationship with God, dealing with the sin that separates us from God. In verse 7, we're told, this is all lost on the disciples in the room. In so many ways, they didn't get who Jesus really was, what he was to do, or the impact of this on their relationship with God, with themselves, with each other, and with the world around them. Interestingly, it's verse 6. It's Peter who perhaps most clearly demonstrates the enormous distance between what Jesus' actions were communicating and what the disciples understood. Peter's mind was living in the here and the now. His lens was purely himself, and what all this might have to do with him and his relationship with Jesus. Jesus was enacting, communicating, demonstrating to his disciples the big salvation story, the story of self-sacrifice, of suffering, of pain, of death, of resurrection, of hope, of redemption, restoration, and forgiveness. Perhaps Peter's lack of insight goes a long way to explain his characteristically strong reaction. Who of us would not be embarrassed to have someone that we respected, admired, dare I say, loved, bend down, invade our personal space, intimately touch our bodies and wash our feet? But in verse 8, we do get a glimmer that Peter's beginning to grasp that what Jesus' words and actions are not just about the here and the now. The second half of verse 8 and into verse 9, despite his over-the-top reaction, Peter knew that he wanted a relationship with Jesus. For all that he knew about him, all that he'd seen, all that had happened, he didn't want to throw it away. But he was still being too literal, still too focused on himself. And there in verse 10, Jesus responds, if you're clean, you don't need a bath. And then he says to them, you are clean, even to those that he hadn't yet washed their feet. If they'd really understood, if they had really known, as Jesus declares, it was him, not what he was washing, that not the fact that he was washing their feet, that made them clean. But John doesn't let us dwell on what has been said or done. He moves us on again. Again, he's selective and particular in the language that he uses to make a point to his original readers. In verse 12, the first part of verse 12 says Jesus put on his clothes. Rather, he took up or he received, the word suggests to us. Jesus had made clean, he has cleansed, achieved through the self-giving of his life. And this is to be followed by Jesus' receiving or his taking up of life again, resurrection life. In the second half of verse 12, we read that Jesus returned to his place. Literally, he sat down. He completed that which he'd set out to do. His mission accomplished, death defeated, redemption achieved, forgiveness found. Transformation was now possible. It's then as if Jesus shifts the focus, his rhetorical question underlining that really they didn't grasp what he was talking about. So he changes the tack. He now shifts from the bigger picture to the personal, from the way in which a disciple's relationship with God is restored to what impact that relationship should have on the life of a disciple. Jesus' comments here about teacher and Lord are not so much about knowing the right way to address Jesus. They're more about those in the room grasping the implication of these two descriptors, Lord and teacher, on their understanding of being a disciple. Jesus is being consistent. I am your teacher. I'm your instructor, your coach, a mentor. And as such, my role is to enable you to learn how to live lives that you can love God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind, and to love your neighbour as yourself. But I'm also your Lord, Jesus says. I'm the Son of God, God made flesh. Consistent in that it is only as the Son of God without sin that all that he had enacted and spoken of earlier in the evening, giving his life as a sacrifice so that we could be made clean from sin, could be achieved. Jesus says, I've done this. I've washed your feet. Now you should do the same. What I've done this evening is an example for you. But more importantly, I am an example to you. Pretty blunt, very simple, straightforward words and language. I've done this. Now as a disciple, you should do it for one another. If this was just a lesson in humility, then Jesus would have perhaps said, no master is greater than his servant. But this is so much more than humility. Jesus is calling his disciples to follow his example of foot washing. Well, no, not really. You see, if this is our takeaway, perhaps then, like Peter, we've missed the point. It was never really about dirty feet. Paul got it when he wrote to the church in Philippi. Let me read from the Message translation of the Bible. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 5. Think of yourselves the way Christ Jesus thought of himself. He had equal status with God, but didn't think so much of himself that he had to cling to the advantage of that status no matter what. Not at all. When the time came, he set aside the privileges of deity and took on the status of a slave, becoming human. Having become human, he stayed human. It was an incredible, humbling process. He didn't claim special privileges. Instead, he lived a selfless, obedient life, and then a selfless, obedient death. And the worst kind of death at that, a crucifixion. Selfless, obedient life. Perhaps other words we could add: self-sacrifice, self-giving, service of others. All this was seen in Jesus' attitude and actions during Holy Week. So what about this? Hand washing is the new foot washing. No, I've not lost the plot and got my human anatomy all muddled up. Perhaps we could think of hand washing as a physical expression of sacrifice, self-giving and service. Hand washing is a very important part of our strategic response to the prevention of the spread of COVID-19. It's very important and something that we should all continue to do. There are real and necessary physical benefits to washing our hands regularly for 20 seconds, as suggested. But as we wash our hands, what's our internal attitude and approach like? What are we thinking about ourselves? And what are our thoughts and our attitudes about others? We've all seen some of the appalling images of the panic buying and hoarding of provisions in recent weeks. We can wash our hands, but we're still primarily thinking about ourselves. But we've also seen and heard some awesome stories of love, of care, and of support for others in the midst of our current crisis. True examples of where the priority and focus has been on others. We're all finding ourselves living life very differently at present, in circumstances and situations that we could not have imagined a couple of months ago. What might sacrifice, self-giving, and service to others look like today? It's perhaps too easy to limit this to those in our society who are working on the front line, to expect from them attitudes and approaches that we're not prepared to adopt ourselves. Self-sacrifice, self-giving, and service of others. Each of us lives for Jesus on our own front line. It is on these front lines that Jesus calls us to adopt the same attitude as him, because he knows that we and others around us will be blessed if we do.
From heaven you came, helpless babe. his feet. The scars that speak of sacrifice, hands that flung stars into space.